The listening lamp flickers to life, illuminating the space between worlds. Here, science whispers to spirit, and reality bends to imagination. Curl up in the cosmic glow as we unveil the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. The Last Commute, a short story written by Rob Corrigan, narrated by Trevor Mishi.
Michael's alarm shattered the pre-dawn silence, its insistent beeping pulling him from dreams he couldn't quite remember. His hand found the phone by muscle memory, thumb sliding across the screen even before his eyes opened. 6:15 a.m. Same as every workday for the past 8 years. The morning routine unfolded with practiced efficiency: shower, shave, coffee gulped too hot while buttoning his shirt. A half-eaten piece of toast dangled from his mouth as he knotted his tie, his reflection in the bathroom mirror oddly unfamiliar for a moment. Something about his own eyes gave him pause, but the thought slipped away as his phone buzzed with a work email. Sarah was already gone, her side of the bed cold. Early surgery at the hospital. Their schedules rarely aligned these days, ships passing in the night of their marriage. He checked on Emma's room, empty of course. College freshmen didn't come home on weeknights. When had their daughter grown so independent? The thought carried a weight he didn't have time to examine. Outside, the morning air held the crisp promise of autumn. Michael joined the stream of commuters flowing toward the station, briefcase bumping against his leg in time with his hurried steps. The familiar weight of his laptop inside felt somehow significant today, though he couldn't say why. He caught the 7:05 with seconds to spare, squeezing through the doors just before they closed with their pneumatic sigh. The same faces surrounded him, the elderly Asian woman who always sat in the third row, today wearing a grey cardigan that seemed to shimmer oddly in the fluorescent light. The young mother cradling her infant, dark circles beneath her eyes suggesting another sleepless night. The businessman who never looked up from his phone, his rapid-fire typing creating a staccato undertone to the train's rhythm. Something about the scene struck Michael as strange, a feeling of déjà vu so strong it made him dizzy. He'd seen this exact moment before, down to the way sunlight caught the young mother's wedding ring as she adjusted her baby's blanket. But that was impossible, wasn't it? His phone buzzed again. Another work email marked urgent, though they all were these days. Michael began typing a response, his attention divided between the screen and the nagging sense that something was wrong. The businessman's voice cut through his concentration. "Markets opening strong in Singapore." And Michael looked up, a sudden chill racing down his spine. He knew those words, knew the exact moment the young mother would stand to soothe her fussing baby, knew the precise angle of sunlight that would catch the elderly woman's silver hair like a halo. Knew. The train shuddered. Metal screamed against metal. Time stretched like taffy as Michael watched his phone float upward in the sudden weightlessness, screen still glowing with his half-finished email. The businessman's coffee cup described a perfect arc through the air, droplets suspended like amber beads. The young mother clutched her baby tighter, her mouth opening in a scream that hadn't yet reached Michael's ears. The elderly woman met his eyes across the aisle, her gaze holding something like recognition, something like sorrow. Her lips moved, forming words he somehow knew but couldn't quite hear over the approaching roar. Then everything went white. Michael opened his eyes to his alarm beeping, 6:15 a.m. His hand found the phone by muscle memory, but this time he didn't immediately silence it. Instead, he lay perfectly still, heart pounding, as the first tendrils of understanding began to creep in. The day was starting again, but this time he remembered what was coming. The second loop carried an edge of hysteria. Michael burst onto the train, startling the other passengers with his frantic energy. "You have to listen," he began, but his words died in his throat as he met their blank stares. The elderly woman, he still didn't know her name, watched him with those knowing eyes, her grey cardigan shimmering like disturbed water. "The train," he tried again. "There's going to be an accident. We need to—" "Market's opening strong in Singapore," the businessman interrupted, never looking up from his phone. The exact same words, spoken in the exact same cadence. Michael's warning died unheard as the young mother stood to soothe her fussing baby, movements precise as a dance step he'd already witnessed. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. The screen lit up with his photo gallery instead of the keypad. His thumb froze above the glass as images began scrolling past without his input. Pictures he hadn't taken, couldn't have taken. Sarah in a hospital corridor, her surgeon's composure cracking as she clutched a clipboard. Emma looking lost in her college sweatshirt, holding a paper coffee cup in the same waiting room. Both their faces drawn with worry, with fear, with a grief he didn't want to understand. The timestamp on the photos read, "Tomorrow." "It's not real," he whispered. But even as he spoke, the young mother turned to retrieve her dropped pacifier, a movement he remembered from the first loop, performed with choreographic precision. Michael stumbled to an empty seat, head spinning. The train's rhythm felt wrong now. Its familiar sway transformed into something almost organic, like a heartbeat growing steadily more arrhythmic. He tried the emergency intercom, the windows, even the space between cars. Nothing responded. The doors remained sealed, the outside world visible but untouchable beyond the glass. "You're wasting time," a soft voice said. He turned to find the elderly woman watching him, her eyes dark with something that might have been compassion. But when he tried to respond, she was looking away again, hands folded serenely in her lap as if she'd never spoken. The businessman's voice provided its predictable counterpoint. "Markets opening strong in Singapore." The words had lost all meaning, becoming just another note in this maddening symphony of repetition. Michael's phone buzzed. He knew what he'd find before looking. Photos from an impossible future. His family gathered around a hospital bed he couldn't quite see. The perspective was wrong somehow, as if the pictures had been taken from above, from an angle that— The train shuddered. "No," Michael gasped. "Not again. Please, not—" Time stretched. The businessman's coffee described its perfect arc. The young mother reached for her child with infinite slowness, and the elderly woman— She turned to him one more time, her cardigan rippling like mercury, her mouth forming words that might have been, "Next time." Then darkness. The alarm beeped, 6:15 a.m. Michael lay still, tears sliding silently into his pillow as his phone glowed with its impossible gallery of future grief. Somewhere in the growing light of dawn, a train was waiting, and he was running out of chances to understand why. The third loop began differently. Michael found himself not in his body, but hovering near the train's ceiling, watching himself board with the usual rushed, apologetic smile. The perspective shift brought with it a new kind of vision. The passengers glowed with inner light of varying intensities, their thoughts and emotions visible as colours swirling around them like aurora borealis. The businessman, Thomas Chen, Michael somehow knew now, radiated anxiety in sharp yellow spikes. His urgent phone calls masked a deeper fear. His daughter's college tuition was due, and the market's opening wouldn't save him this time. Each tap of his finger on the phone's screen sent ripples through the air like stones dropped in still water. The young mother's aura pulsed with exhaustion's deep blue. Jenny Martinez, working 2 jobs since her husband's death, the baby a last gift from a love cut short. Her determination to survive wrapped around her and her child like a protective cocoon, shot through with threads of both despair and hope. Other stories revealed themselves in this strange new sight. The teenager by the door, terrified of coming out to his parents. The nurse heading home from night shift, carrying the weight of 3 lost patients. Each soul on the train contained universes of joy and pain, victories and regrets, all interweaving in complex patterns Michael had never noticed before. "It's overwhelming at first, seeing the truth behind the masks we wear," said Mrs. Way. He knew her name now, though he couldn't say how. She stood beside his floating consciousness, her form more solid than the others, her grey cardigan rippling with starlight. "I'm in a coma, aren't I?" Michael asked, the reality finally settling into his bones. "The accident, it already happened." "Yes," her voice held gentle certainty. "Your body lies in St. Margaret's Hospital. Sarah hasn't left your side in 3 days." The knowledge should have terrified him, but from this perspective, it felt almost peaceful. Why am I here? Why am I seeing all this? Because you need to understand what was always here, hidden beneath the surface of ordinary moments. Mrs. Way gestured to the luminous souls surrounding them. "Each person on this train has a story that intersects with yours. Each carries a lesson you need to learn before you can choose. Choose what?" But even as he asked, the train shuddered. Michael felt himself being pulled back into his body, the wonderful, terrible awareness of others' inner lives fading like a dream at dawn. "No," he protested, fighting against the return to limited perception. "I'm not ready." "Then change it," Mrs. Way's voice followed him down. "Fight the pattern. See what happens when you reject what must be." The world turned inside out. Michael found himself back in his body. But everything was wrong. Passengers flickering like bad television reception. Reality stuttering around him as his denial created ripples of distortion. The train's walls became transparent, showing other versions of the same journey playing out in parallel tracks of time. "Stop," he begged, but he wasn't sure who he was talking to. The businessman's words about Singapore's markets repeated on endless loop, fragmenting into meaningless syllables. The young mother multiplied into dozens of versions, each holding her baby at a slightly different angle. And through it all, Mrs. Way watched with ancient eyes as reality itself began to tear apart. The crash, when it came, felt like the universe shattering. Michael's alarm broke the silence. 6:15 a.m. He opened his eyes to find tears on his cheeks and a new understanding burning in his heart. He couldn't fight what had already happened, but perhaps he could still help shape what happened next. If only he was brave enough to face the truth behind the endless loops of morning light. The fourth loop transformed the train entirely. Gone were the hard plastic seats and fluorescent lights, replaced by something that felt more like memory given form. The walls had become translucent, showing not the city outside, but landscapes of emotion, rolling hills of regret, deep valleys of loss, mountains of joy that pierced clouds made of forgotten dreams. Michael moved through this new reality with growing purpose. The passengers remained, but they too had changed, their forms less solid, more true to what they really were, souls caught between one moment and the next, trapped in the space between life and death. He found Jenny Martinez first, the young mother whose exhausted determination had touched him before. She sat cradling her baby in arms made of morning light, tears falling like stars. "He'll never know his father," she whispered as Michael approached. "I couldn't save him, and now my baby will never know." "Tell me about him," Michael said gently, understanding his role at last. Jenny's story poured out like water. Love found late, happiness cut short by a drunk driver, her fierce determination to carry their child into a world that suddenly held no certainty. As she spoke, the air around them filled with images. Her husband's smile, their small apartment full of big dreams, the moment she'd learned she was pregnant just days after the funeral. The baby in her arms flickered between solid form and pure light, a soul not yet fully anchored to either world. "He knows," Michael said, the truth coming from somewhere beyond his own understanding. "Your love for each other, it's written into his very being. He'll carry that always, even if he never has the memories." Jenny's form grew more luminous as acceptance washed through her. She smiled, really smiled, for the first time since Michael had begun noticing her on these endless journeys. Then both she and the baby faded, not into darkness but into peace, leaving behind an echo of gratitude that tasted like joy. Others came to him as the train moved through landscapes of the heart. Thomas Chen, the businessman, trapped by guilt over choices that had prioritized wealth over family. The nurse, Sarah's colleague as it turned out, carrying the weight of those she couldn't save. Each soul needed something different: understanding, forgiveness, simply the chance to be heard. Mrs. Wei appeared between each encounter, her presence anchoring him in this strange space. "You're learning," she said, her grey cardigan now clearly woven from starlight and shadow. "But there are harder truths ahead." "Who are you really?" Michael asked. "Why are you helping me?" She smiled, the expression achingly familiar. "You know who I am, Michael. You just haven't let yourself remember yet." Before he could respond, reality shifted again. The train's walls became mirrors, each one reflecting a different moment from his own life. Fights with Sarah he couldn't take back. Moments with Emma he'd missed because work seemed more important. Chances to show love he'd let slip away because he thought there would always be more time. "This isn't just about helping them, is it?" he asked, understanding blooming like dawn. "No," Mrs. Wei said softly. "But sometimes we have to heal others before we can face healing ourselves." The train shuddered, but differently now. Instead of violence, the movement felt like transition, one world flowing into another, one truth preparing to become something new. Michael closed his eyes, feeling the weight of all he still needed to understand. When the darkness came this time, it felt less like ending and more like turning a page. The alarm woke him to another 6:15, but now he knew. Each loop brought him closer to whatever truth waited at the end of this strange journey between stations of the soul. He just hoped he had enough time to learn what he needed before his final choice arrived. The fifth loop stripped away all pretense. The train had become a vessel of pure memory, each window opening onto different lives, different regrets. Michael walked the aisle like a curator in a gallery of unfinished stories, each passenger's truth unfolding before him in waves of light and shadow. The teenager hiding his identity revealed a family dinner from last week, his father's casual homophobia cutting deeper than any physical wound. The nurse shared the moment she'd lost her first patient, the weight of that death still dragging at her soul. Each story connected to Michael's own life in ways he was only now beginning to understand. "You're starting to see the patterns," Mrs. Wei said, appearing beside him. Her grey cardigan shifted like smoke, revealing glimpses of other moments, other times. How every life touches every other life. How no story truly stands alone. A window flared with sudden brightness, showing Michael something he'd spent decades trying to forget. Himself at 8 years old, sitting beside a hospital bed. A familiar wrinkled hand held his own as monitors beeped in countdown rhythm. "You never forgave yourself," Mrs. Way said softly, "for falling asleep just before I passed." The truth hit him like a physical blow. "Grandmother?" he whispered, really looking at her for the first time. Behind the ageless calm of her current form, he saw the woman who had taught him to fold paper cranes, who had told him stories about spirits walking between worlds, who had promised she'd always watch over him. "I tried to stay awake," he said, words he'd held back for 30 years finally breaking free. "I wanted to be there, to say goodbye." "Oh, my dear heart." Her hand touched his cheek, warm as sunlight. "You were there in all the ways that mattered. Your love gave me peace. But you locked that guilt away so tightly, it became a wall between you and everyone else." The train's windows flickered with evidence. Moments he'd missed with Emma because he was afraid of losing her too. Connections he'd failed to make with Sarah because letting someone that close meant risking that same pain again. Each scene reflected in the tears now falling freely down his face. "Is that why I'm here?" he asked. "To finally let that go?" "That's part of it." Mrs. Way's form shifted, becoming both the grandmother he remembered and something more ancient, more knowing. "But there's another truth waiting, one that will be much harder to face." As if summoned by her words, a new presence made itself known. The conductor's soul, burning with a darkness that spoke of rage and unforgiven sin. Michael felt an answering darkness in his own heart, a recognition he wasn't yet ready to face. "All these souls," Mrs. Way said, gesturing to the passengers caught between stations of existence. "They're here because of choices made, actions taken, words spoken or left unsaid." Her eyes held infinite compassion as she added, "including yours." The train shuddered, reality preparing to reset once again. But before darkness claimed him, Michael saw himself through the windows, not his current self, but the man he'd been that fateful morning. He watched his past self pull out a phone, fingers moving across the screen with deadly distraction. And he understood what the next loop would reveal. The alarm woke him to 6:15, but this time he lay still, tears falling into his pillow as the weight of responsibility settled over him like a shroud. He had helped other souls face their truths. Now it was time to face his own. The truth revealed itself like a series of photographs developing in dark liquid. In this loop, Michael watched from outside himself as his past self arrived at the station, already absorbed in his phone's urgent demands. But this time, he saw what he'd refused to see before. The conductor swaying slightly at the platform's edge, one hand pressed against his temple, face pale with pain. "A stroke waiting to happen," Mrs. Way said softly beside him. "You weren't the only one who noticed." The scene expanded, showing him other passengers. The nurse who recognized the symptoms but was too exhausted after her night shift to trust her judgment. The medical student who thought someone more qualified would surely speak up. The retired doctor running late for his golf game. A dozen people who saw, who knew, who remained silent. "I almost said something," Michael whispered, watching his past self look up, frown slightly at the conductor's obvious distress, then return to his email. "I had the thought right there, but there was always the next moment," Mrs. Way finished, until there wasn't. The loop continued its merciless replay. The conductor's condition deteriorated slowly through the journey, each skipped signal and delayed reaction bringing them closer to catastrophe. Michael saw now how other passengers noticed, how a web of collective responsibility formed and dissolved in silent assumptions that someone else would act. All those people, he said, understanding blooming like a dark flower. We all chose convenience over concern, all thought someone else would handle it. The train's windows filled with new images, his family in the hospital room where his body lay. Sarah, her surgeon's composure cracking as she read his latest test results. Emma, trying to do homework in the waiting room while stealing glances at monitors she didn't quite understand. They're going to let me go, Michael realized, seeing the papers in Sarah's hands. Forms about life support, about final decisions. They think I can't come back. Can you? His grandmother asked. Carrying this weight of shared guilt, knowing you could have prevented it with a single word of concern? The conductor's soul manifested then, his form flickering between health and the moment of his stroke, each version radiating a different shade of accusation. Around them, other spirits stirred. Every passenger who had chosen silence, each soul now trapped between stations by their collective failure to act. I'm sorry, Michael said, the words falling into silence like stones into deep water. We all are. We should have. Should, the conductor's spirit said, voice rough with pain. The hollowest word in any language. Michael felt himself beginning to fade. Guilt pulling him down into darkness. How could he face returning to life, knowing he had been part of this web of fatal indifference? How could any of them? But then another voice cut through his spiral of self-recrimination. Emma, sitting beside his hospital bed, reading aloud from his favorite book. Dad, she said between passages, if you can hear me, we need you to fight. Whatever's holding you back, whatever you're afraid to face, please come home. The words reached into his dissolving soul like a lifeline. Michael grasped at them, trying to hold himself together against the weight of responsibility threatening to erase him completely. Time grows short, his grandmother said. The train's windows showed Sarah walking into a meeting with hospital administrators, forms clutched against her chest like shields. You must choose soon, fade into comfortable darkness, or face the harder path of return. How can I? Michael asked. After what we allowed to happen? That's the question, isn't it? Mrs. Way's form flickered between grandmother and guide. Is guilt a prison to hide in? Or a lesson to teach others? The train shuddered, reality preparing to reset. But this time, the darkness held an edge of finality. One way or another, these loops were approaching their end. Michael felt himself being pulled back toward waking, back towards 6:15, and another chance to face what his silence had helped create. The alarm broke silence like a promise shattering. Michael opened his eyes to find his phone already in his hand, its screen showing Sarah's latest message. Meeting with doctors at noon. Please, wherever you are, come back to us. Time, he realized, was running out, for all of them. This loop felt thinner somehow, reality stretched translucent as onion skin. Michael could see multiple versions of the train layered atop each other. The physical vehicle where a dozen people chose silence, the spiritual vessel carrying those same souls trapped by their collective failure, and something else, something that existed in the space between heartbeats of the universe. He moved with newfound purpose, understanding at last what needed to be done. The nurse came first, her exhaustion now a familiar weight in the air between them. You saw the signs, Michael said gently. The left-sided weakness, the slurred speech. Your training screamed at you to act. I was so tired, she whispered. Thought I might be imagining things, thought someone else would. We all did, Michael took her hand, sharing the weight of their shared guilt. But that's why we're here, not just to acknowledge our failure, but to learn from it. Understanding bloomed in her eyes. Her spirit brightened as she accepted her part in what had happened, the truth setting her free to move beyond this liminal space. She faded into whatever lay ahead, her departure feeling like forgiveness. One by one, Michael helped the others face their role in the tragedy. The medical student released his fear of speaking up. The retired doctor confronted his casual indifference, each soul transformed by accepting their piece of responsibility, by the simple grace of acknowledging what they had failed to do. Only the conductor remained, his spirit flickering between health and illness, between anger and pain. They faced each other in the space between train cars, where reality grew thin enough to hear time itself ticking past. "You all saw," he said, voice rough with accusation. "Every one of you knew." "Yes," Michael let the truth stand naked between them. "We chose convenience over concern, silence over involvement, our collective failure." "Then why are you still here?" The conductor's form wavered. "Why haven't you faded into the nothing you all deserve?" "Because fading would be easier than facing what we did," Michael said. "Because these souls deserve better than our continued cowardice. Because..." He paused, understanding blooming. "Because you deserve better." The conductor's anger faltered. "What?"
You were a good man, a dedicated man, someone who showed up every day despite feeling unwell, despite a system that didn't support you asking for help. Michael stepped forward. "You deserve to be angry, but more than that, you deserve peace." "Peace?" The word emerged like broken glass. "There is no peace in what happened." "No," Michael agreed, "but there might be peace in what happens next, if we're brave enough to find out." Mrs. Way appeared then, her form glowing with starlight. "The time comes," she said softly. "The doctors gather. A decision approaches." Through the windows, Michael saw his family in the hospital room, Sarah holding his hand, Emma crying silently in the corner. Forms waited on a clipboard, their purpose clear even from this distance. "Will you help me?" he asked the conductor. "One last task before we both face what comes next?" The conductor's form steadied slightly. "Why should I?" "Because your anger traps you as much as our guilt traps us. Because those still caught here need both of us to light their way home." Michael held out his hand. "Because forgiveness, even for collective failure, is the only force strong enough to break these cycles." For a long moment, everything balanced on a knife's edge of possibility. Then, slowly, the conductor's hand met his. Light flared between them. Not the false brightness of fluorescent bulbs, but something older, something that spoke of stars and silence and the space where all souls meet. Together, they turned to face the final passengers, the last souls needing guidance to move beyond their shared failure. The train shuddered, reality preparing to shift one last time. Michael's alarm shattered silence. 6:15. In a hospital room across town, doctors were gathering. Time, in all its forms, was running out.
One loop remained. Everything would end or begin again with what came next. The last loop stripped away all pretense. The train had become more idea than object, its walls transparent as thought, showing multiple layers of reality overlapping like pages in an ancient book. Michael stood with the conductor at what had once been the engine car, watching time itself flow past the windows in streams of light and shadow. "They're gathering now," Mrs. Way said, appearing beside them. Through the ethereal walls, they could see the hospital room where Michael's body lay, doctors in white coats consulting charts, Sarah clutching Emma's hand as they listened to words that carried the weight of endings. "We don't have much time,"
Michael said, feeling reality growing thinner with each passing moment. The conductor nodded, his form steadier now but still flickering between health and the moment of his stroke, like a photo refusing to fully develop. Together, they moved through the train's transformed space. The remaining passengers, souls still trapped by their shared failure to act, huddled in groups, their forms translucent with uncertainty. The young medical student who had doubted his own judgment. The businessman who had been too absorbed in his phone to notice another's distress. Each one carrying their piece of the collective guilt that had created this liminal space between moments. It was never just about one person's choice, Michael explained, understanding blooming as he spoke. We're all connected, all responsible for each other. Every time we choose silence over action, convenience over concern, we tear a hole in the fabric that holds us together, the conductor finished, his voice holding less anger now, more comprehension. And sometimes, those holes become spaces where souls get trapped. Emma's voice drifted through the thinning walls of reality, still reading from Michael's favorite book, her words creating bridges between worlds. And in the end, we must all face the choices we've made. Mrs. Way's form shifted, becoming somehow more present, yet less solid, as if she were simultaneously part of multiple realities. The veil grows thin, she said. Soon there will be no more loops, no more chances to understand. Michael felt the truth of it in his dissolving bones. Moving with renewed purpose, he and the conductor began their final work, helping each soul acknowledge their part in what had happened, not to deepen their guilt but to free them from its weight. We all saw, the medical student admitted, tears falling like starlight. We all knew something was wrong. Yes, Michael said gently, but knowing isn't the end of the story. It's what we do with that knowledge going forward that matters. One by one, the remaining passengers faced their truth. Each acknowledgement sent ripples through the train's fabric, reality reshaping itself around their understanding. The businessman finally looked up from his phone, really seeing the world around him. The retired doctor confronted his casual indifference to others' pain. As each soul found peace, they faded, not into darkness, but into whatever lay beyond this space between moments. The train grew more transparent with each departure, its boundaries becoming increasingly theoretical. Through it all, Emma's voice continued weaving between worlds. Dad, the doctors say, they say we have to decide soon, but I feel like you're still here, still trying to tell us something. Time grows short, Mrs. Way warned as the last passenger faded into light. The moment of choice approaches. Michael turned to the conductor, whose form had steadied into something more permanent, though whether in life or death remained unclear. Thank you, Michael said, for helping them, for helping me understand. Understanding goes both ways, the conductor replied, his eyes holding a different kind of knowledge now. Sometimes it takes seeing through another's eyes to recognize our own truth. The train shuddered, not with violence this time, but with the kind of tremor that comes when reality prepares to reshape itself into something new. Through walls that barely existed now, Michael could see doctors entering his hospital room, forms in their hands that would determine what happened next. Mrs. Way's form brightened, stars swimming beneath the surface of her grey cardigan. The final station approaches, she said, but first there's one more truth you need to face. Michael felt it coming. The last revelation, the hardest understanding. The train's remaining substance began to dissolve around them as Sarah lifted a pen, its point hovering above the forms that would end one journey and begin another. Emma's voice cut through the fading reality one last time. Dad, wherever you are, whatever you're fighting, please, come home. The light grew blinding, reality preparing for its final transformation. And in that brightness, Michael saw the truth he'd been avoiding since the loops began. The hardest truth of all. Time held its breath, waiting to see what he would do with this last understanding. Everything balanced on the edge of choice.
And somewhere, in a hospital room that felt both infinitely distant and impossibly close, a pen waited above paper, ready to write an ending. Or perhaps a beginning. The final truth unfolded like a map of moments. Michael's own phone in his hands that morning, his distracted reply to an urgent email as he boarded the train, how his divided attention had prevented him from noticing not just the conductor's distress, but also the loose coupling that his daily commute had taught him to recognize by sound. A simple maintenance report he'd meant to file the week before, delayed by deadlines and digital demands. He hadn't just been part of the collective failure, he had been its catalyst. There it is, Mrs. Way said softly, her form now pure light contained loosely in the shape of his grandmother. The understanding you've been running from through all these loops. The train had ceased to exist in any conventional sense. They stood in a space made of pure potential, where multiple realities overlapped like sheets of glass. Through each layer, Michael could see different versions of that morning playing out. Paths not taken, choices not made, words not spoken that might have changed everything. The conductor's spirit moved through these layers like smoke through light. "So now you know," he said, but his voice held no accusation now, only a deep weariness. The full weight of consequence. "Yes," Michael's voice cracked on the word. "I could have, if I had just..." "Should," Mrs. Way reminded him gently, the hollowest word in any language. Through the thinning veils of reality, the hospital scene crystallized into sharp focus. Sarah's hand trembled above the forms that would end his life support. Emma had stopped reading, her book closed in her lap like a door shutting. The moment of final decision hung suspended between one breath and the next. "I don't deserve to go back," Michael whispered. "Not after..." "Ah," the conductor's spirit brightened suddenly. "Now you understand what I've been waiting for. Not your guilt, I had that already. But this moment, this choice..." Understanding bloomed in Michael's dissolving heart. "You need my acceptance of responsibility, my willingness to face it, not to punish me, but to free us both," the conductor finished. His form had steadied completely now, no longer flickering between health and illness. Guilt without acceptance is just another prison, one that traps both the guilty and the wronged. Mrs. Way moved through the layers of reality like starlight through crystal. "The choice was always yours," she said. "Fade into comfortable darkness or return to face the harder path of living with truth." "And if I go back?" Michael asked. "What then?" "Then you carry this understanding with you," the conductor said. "You help others see what we all learned too late, that every moment holds the potential for action or inaction, for connection or denial, for choices that ripple out beyond our knowing." Through the dissolving veils, Michael saw Sarah's pen touch paper. Time stretched thin as hope. "Dad?" Emma's voice reached through layers of reality. "If you're still there, we love you." Michael felt the weight of all he'd learned settle into whatever passed for his soul in this space between moments. The burden of responsibility, yes, but also the gift of understanding. The knowledge that even the smallest choices could create bridges or barriers between hearts. "I'll tell them," he promised the conductor. "I'll help them understand." About all of it, the distractions, the assumptions, the cost of collective silence. I know you will. The conductor's spirit began to fade, not into darkness, but into light. That's why I can finally let go. Mrs. Way's starlit form moved closer. Time to choose, dear heart. The morning light approaches. Michael looked one last time at all the layers of reality spread before him. The might-have-beens, the could-bes, the infinite possibilities that each moment contained. Then he turned towards the growing brightness where his family waited. "Come with me?" he asked his grandmother. Her smile held all the love he remembered and more. "I never left you," she said. "I've been in every act of kindness, every moment of connection, every choice to reach out instead of turn away. That's what it means to truly watch over someone." The light grew blinding. Michael felt reality reshaping itself around him, felt the weight of physical form returning like waves returning to shore. Somewhere, a pen lifted from paper, form still unsigned. His eyes opened to white hospital walls and the sound of his daughter's joyful cry. Sarah's hand found his, warm and real and anchoring. Words would come later, explanations, apologies, promises to do better. For now, he simply held them close, feeling the miracle of connection, of responsibility accepted, of love that transcended even the boundaries between life and death. Outside the window, dawn painted the city in shades of beginning. Somewhere in that growing light, a train carried strangers bound together by countless small choices, each one an opportunity to reach out, to speak up, to choose connection over convenience. And if sometimes, in quiet moments between stations, passengers glimpsed an elderly woman in a grey cardigan watching over them with starlit eyes, well, that too was part of the miracle of morning light. Every end, after all, is just another kind of beginning. All we have to do is choose to see it that way. Choose to act on what we see. Choose to remember what the dawn teaches us every day, that even the darkest night carries within it the seeds of new understanding, waiting to bloom in the light of grace and second chances. Michael squeezed his family's hands and began the journey of living up to that truth, one moment at a time.
Thank you for illuminating your imagination with the listening lamp. If our tale has sparked a light in your mind, we invite you to keep that flame burning. Subscribe to our podcast and join us again as we continue to explore the vast cosmos of human experience. Until next time, may your inner light guide you through the mysteries that await.